Welcome. I'm Michael McQuarrie. I'm the director of the Center for Work and Democracy and associate professor in the School of Social Transformation. I'm here today to discuss quick fixes, drugs in America from Prohibition to the 21st Century Binge, published by Verso Press with its author, Ben Fong. Ben is also associate director of the Center for Work and Democracy, and he is an associate professor in the Barrett Honors College. So Ben, congratulations on the publication of the book. Terrific read. But why don't we start by just telling me a little bit about what you're trying to accomplish in the book and what inspired you to take it on as a project?
Sure. I mean, the anecdotal evidence was that more people than ever in my own social circles were using drugs in various kinds. And I was guessing that this had to do with various things. The destigmatization of mental illness, for instance. People are much more open about the kinds of psychiatric medications they're taking. Different trends in decriminalization and legalization that have more people using different kinds of drugs that in my childhood had a great deal of stigma around them. And so I wanted to look into it a little bit more, and the numbers are pretty shocking. I mean, basically in the 21st century, every metric of American drug consumption is at a historic high, and it's going up, with the notable exception of cocaine, which we could talk about maybe later. But really across the board, opioids, amphetamines, antidepressants, antipsychotics, marijuana, like you name it, every drug, we're using more of it than ever, and we're increasingly using more of it than ever. At the same time, we have this, now zombified war on drugs that continues apace. The largest prison system in the world, a full 1/5 of people are in there for nonviolent drug offenses. So it's this massive contradiction at the heart of American society. And I wanted to write it to try to make sense of why that is.
And just to clarify, what do you mean by zombified when you talk about the current policing and penal regime?
Yeah, I mean, it's still going on. I would say that the critics of the war on drugs, however, are no longer just on the left. As they have been for a long time, but they're now on the right as well. I think across the political spectrum, a lot of people are coming to realize that the traditional way in which we have policed drug use has been an utter failure, a massive failure on its own right, just in terms of like stemming drug consumption, but also it bears all sorts of perverse consequences that lead to greater social ills than if it didn't exist. So it's still continuing on, but I would say that it's lost its like ideological justification, that people no longer believe in it in the same way, even though it still continues on.
So we're going to talk a little bit about how you periodize drug regimes, because it's not just a story about the contemporary era, but we'll get to that in a minute. But before we get there, it's probably worth saying at the outset that this is not a typical book on drug policy. So, you're sort of standing outside of these debates and trying to give an alternative perspective on it. And can you tell me a little bit about why you have chosen not to sort of situate yourself in that traditional debate?
Yeah, I think that's a good characterization. I think that one perspective on drugs, the traditionally conservative perspective, is that they cause great personal suffering, social harm, and they should be policed and regulated in more efficient ways, right? I think that's kind of the standard view. There's now a great deal of liberal drug reformers, you could call them, who are pushing for decriminalization, for legalization, for various police reforms, all of which are salutary in their own right. In a lot of ways, I think that they're in ascendance in a way that the old prohibitionists are not. We're seeing increasingly successful decriminalization and legalization movements. And I think that we're going to continue to see so in the next decade or so. And these are roughly the two tracks of drug discourse, right? There's the sort of traditional prohibitionists, and then there's the sort of liberal drug reformers. And I want to keep my distance from both. In the case of the prohibitionists, as I said before, it's just been a massive failure. I don't think there's any way in which to justify the war on drugs as it's been prosecuted in the United States. It's across the political spectrum, I think people realize that it just hasn't worked. On the other hand, we're at a very different moment. We're not in Reagan's drug war anymore, right? We're in an era where some of the biggest drug pushers around are, Silicon Valley tech executives, where Peter Thiel has cornered the market in synthetic psilocybin, right? It's becoming big business, and I think that we ought to relax some of the claims around what legalization and decriminalization are going to do for us, because it's so playing into the hands of capital right now. In addition, I think that a lot of the liberal drug reformers sort of think about the basic problem of the drug scourge in America as one that is in need of destigmatization, right? We just need to destigmatize different forms of drug use, provide safe routes of administration for people to use drugs, provide safe environments for them to use drugs. And I would say, these are all, again, salutary in themselves, but the social imperatives behind drug use in America, the kind of the endemic poverty, the competitive, stressful environments, all the different reasons that Americans use drugs, if those aren't in the picture when you're talking about policy solutions to drugs, then I think you're missing a huge part of it, right? Like, we could legalize and decriminalize everything, and we would still have many of the issues that we associate with the drug problem after we do so.
So before we go further, I do want to note for anybody who is watching that if you have questions for Ben, you can put them in the chat. And as we get towards the end of our time, I will pose them to Ben for him to answer. So please put your questions in the chat. Okay, so I think we're going to unpack this a little bit more later, but it's clear that you're neither purely on the side of legalization and that it's fine to just leave this all up to individual autonomy. These are substances that should just be treated as a consumer choice issue versus people who want to repress and police it and so on like that. Yep. And we'll unpack that a little bit over the course of this discussion. But, in terms of justifying your particular perspective and interpretation of what's going on with drugs in America, really one of the key parts of your argument is that America is really exceptional in this regard. And we should always be wary of arguments about American exceptionalism. It's very easy as an American to talk about why America is exceptional. And that can be kind of lazy, but this is important for your particular interpretation. So let's talk a little bit about what makes America exceptional when it comes to drug consumption, debate, policy, and so on.
Yeah, I wish America was not exceptional, and I'm certainly not using exceptional in a good sense in this case.
Right.
But the numbers kind of bear this out, right? Americans, we comprise roughly 4 to 5% of the world's population. We consume 80% of its opioids, 80% of its ADHD medications or amphetamines and amphetamine-like drugs. And if you just think sort of casually about the history of psychoactive drugs, for well over a century, it's been the United States that has been the reference point, right? So the cocaine boom of the 70s and 80s, United States, the American counterculture is most associated with the psychedelic moment in the 60s. Mm-hmm. The post-war era, benzodiazepines, barbiturates, amphetamines, these were all fully normalized drugs. And then even going back to the late 19th century, there's a huge patent medicine industry in the United States. You could walk into any pharmacy and get medically pure heroin, cocaine, chloral hydrate, whatever you wanted. At the same time, the United States is beginning to prosecute the global drug war in the early 1910s. So it's sort of been that way for well over a century. And, there are some exceptions here and there, but American drug use is world historical. It's really quite fabulous. And I think that, if we're trying to make sense of what the United States is at this particular moment in history, we could do worse than look at the history of its drug policy and drug use.
So just to put a fine point on this, I could easily anticipate arguments that would say, well, if we look at it from a per capita perspective, that's wrong. We could look at it from a wealth and leisure perspective. Maybe that makes us look less exceptional. And so let's unpack that a little bit about the nature of the exceptionalism. One thing that you're implying in your response is, we're eager consumers. Some areas we're innovators, right? Like American companies fabricate the drugs, American scientists develop the drugs, this kind of thing. But the other thing you're sort of saying is that I mean, when I think of drug wars, I think of the Opium War as the first sort of example, but of course that was for the opposite of regulation.
Yeah.
But you're citing the beginning of the drug war starting in 1910. So you're trying to give this overarching picture that really presents the United States as a very unusual case in this regard. So unpacking each of these, can you just talk a little bit about them?
Yeah, I mean, there's a simple story to tell, which is that the United States is particular for the particular structures of American society and the stressors that exist for Americans. But I do parse it by historical period. So in each of the historical periods that I talk about in the book, there's different kinds of things that led the United States to, for instance, in the post-war period, it became very important, became very clear to a lot of high officials in the American government that controlling international drug flows was a top priority, right? And this was the case for both licit drug flows and illicit drug flows. Like if you have control over those flows and the precursor drugs and chemicals needed to make different kinds of drugs, that's a huge, that makes you into a very powerful force. And that's the reason why we got a uniquely profitable and large pharmaceutical industry in the United States, because of the seizure of drug flows in that post-war period. So throughout the book, I do try to specify, the particularities of the American exception and to parse it in different ways. But one helpful case in doing so is the temperance movement leading to prohibition.
Yeah.
This is a helpful comparison case because there were temperance movements elsewhere.
Sure.
Some of them successfully led to prohibition, but it was really nothing on the sort of size and scale of the American prohibition experiment, right? It was 13 years where we totally banned alcohol, which should be a remarkable fact still, that Americans who love alcohol did that at some point in our history.
Well, I think it was also one of the largest mass mobilizations in a social movement too.
Yeah, no, I mean, it was a huge national movement, and there are temperance organizations today, like Mothers Against Drunk Driving, for instance, and there are temperance forces that still exist in American society. But I think it's really difficult for us to get into the headspace of what it was like to exist in a society where there was a national force arguing for prohibition, and there was. So why is that, right? Why did the United States uniquely pursue this, what was called the Noble Experiment from 1920 to 1933, when other countries did have temperance movements, sometimes national temperance movements that did result in prohibition, but for a much more limited time? So why America in that case? I mean, I've argued this in the chapter of the book and elsewhere, articles online that people can look up. But what I want to say is that, in the United States, we didn't have the genesis of countervailing forces or structures that would in any way mitigate the effects of industrial capitalism, right? This was a time in Europe where you got the genesis of workers' parties, labor parties, the creation of the welfare state in such a way that, there were political possibilities for pushing back against the social ills that were becoming ever more visible, specifically in urban environments in America, in Europe. And in America, you got no similar development, right? You got sort of de-aligned political parties that didn't really represent working class interests. And in the absence of some pushback to the imperatives of industrial capitalists, I think what you got is a predominantly moral response to different social ills, right? So the Women's Christian Temperance Union, the Anti-Saloon League, these organizations thought of themselves as remedying the problems of capitalism, but without some working class mass movement to do so, right? They thought that they could do it strictly by moral paternalism. And I think that's why it was essentially a failure, right? Because we didn't have some political vehicle for pushing back, we invested in these predominantly moral solutions.
So, I mean, this seems to be, so this is one of the American exceptionalism argument enables you to make this other argument about the particularities of American politics.
Yeah.
And, in some ways, this is an extension of arguments about why there was no socialism in the United
Oh,
States.
very much so, yeah.
Things like that, but also the idea of, so the displacement of class politics into morality.
Yeah.
But is that indicative of American life generally, or is it something that's specific to drug regimes?
Yeah, I mean, I think you can see it more broadly. I mean, one of the claims of the book is that when people talk about drugs and drug policy, they're generally talking about other kinds of things, right? When people talk about their own drug experiences, they're talking about, very personal things often.
Yeah.
And when people legislate around drugs, they're often trying to deal with social problems that aren't immediately about drug abuse or drug consumption. And so part of the book is trying to show that, like, when we talk about drugs and the moral panics around them, and the intense policing around them, we're always sort of talking about something else.
Well, another thing that comes to mind is, a lot of people would make the argument that we treat families this way as well. We treat, television watching this way. That we make these moral arguments that don't really get to the sort of root of the problem. So if the problem of, thinking about the 1960s debates about the Black family, for example, it was framed as a cultural argument that was particular to a group of poor Black people, and that enabled not discussing that poverty might be an issue here, or lack of good housing might be an issue here, or things like that. Yeah, I mean, do you think it's a reasonable analogy to make, or that we can see this kind of moralistic argument?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, sort of like the Moynihan report writ large, sort of.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's right. One temptation in the book. So in terms of like the scope of it, I limit myself just to psychoactive substances. But it is amazing that, like, increasingly many different facets of life are described as if they were drugs, right? So you have this, like, proliferating discourse of behavioral addictions where it's television, social media, gambling, sex, like all sorts of things have now entered the realm where people have traditionally talked about just psychoactive substances, and now they're talking about them as if they were also harmful in the same ways. And I think that this does speak to the kind of conceptual bleed between these domains that you're hinting at.
Yeah. Okay, great.
Yeah.
Let's talk a little bit. I just want to explain a little bit about the scope of the book. I mean, basically what you're doing here is you're giving a historical account of the way different drugs were debated and how that led into specific political and regulatory formations, particularly the development of particular forms of capitalist enterprise, so on, like that. So let's see, the chapters basically cover coffee, which a lot of people probably don't think of as a drug in the same when we think about drug policy, but I'll let you unpack that a little bit. Alcohol, tobacco, opiates, amphetamines, psychotropics, psychedelics, cocaine, and marijuana. And you give a periodization argument that is meant to sort of tie these together in a particular way. But why don't you tell us a little bit about how you see this unfolding over time? This is a broad historical account.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, at the beginning, I sort of break up. So each chapter has its own story to tell. And one of the reasons I wanted to deal with different substances by chapter is because you sort of get a unique lens on American society through different substances. So the kind of story you tell about the United States through the lens of amphetamines obviously differs markedly from that of cocaine, even though, chemically they have very similar effects on our bodies, right? But culturally, the associations are about as wide apart as they could be. But there is a historical narrative that sort of like parses the chapters as well. And I mean, very briefly, it's sort of 4 different phases that should be very familiar to social scientists. Like the first period is roughly, industrialization through the interwar period. Again, there was this huge patent medicine industry at the same time that the United States began began passing domestic drug control. So the Harrison Act in 1914, it effectively banned opium and cocaine. It was the first sort of like federal law of its kind. And just a few years prior to that, the United States had been instrumental in pushing forward global drug controls, international drug control treaties that also controlled, oops, that's my phone, sorry. Thanks, Miro. So that was the first period, right, where we, at the same time that we had this huge drug industry in the form, a legal drug industry in the form of the patent medicine industry, we also began experimenting with different forms of prohibition. The second phase in the book roughly corresponds to what social scientists call the Fordist Keynesian period. You get this rising consumer society. The old moral paternalism falls away for good. So, the temperance forces really lose their moral anchor in American society. And this is a time of fabulous polydrug use. So coffee and cigarettes are at their historic highs in terms of usage, but also, as I said before, amphetamines, benzodiazepine, barbiturates. There's a whole range of drugs that became very easy to access, and were all, sort of taken like adult candy, really. It was sort of like ways in which we got along at the time.
And specifically, what time period are we talking about here, roughly? So it's presumably after Prohibition.
Yeah, so from the 30s to the 60s, roughly. And it's sort of amazing just how available these drugs are. So amphetamines were in some forms available by prescriptions. You had to have a doctor's approval to take them, but there were over-the-counter forms of amphetamines as well. Actually, you could get a methamphetamine inhaler over the counter until 1965.
That is alarming.
And the old inhalers, sorry, I'll just digress a little bit on this one. Yeah. The old inhalers, so today we've got like the regulated dose inhalers where, you puff, and it's pretty regularized, right? You get a certain amount of the drug with every puff. The old inhalers, they were just cotton swabs, sort of soaked in the drug, and they put that in a tube. Put a cap on the tube. If you wanted some of the drug, you'd pop off the cap, you'd take a whiff, you'd put the cap back on. That was what the inhaler was, essentially. And it didn't take long for, industrious teenagers to figure out that you could take out the cotton filler and soak it in a beverage and get a much stronger high, right? It wasn't very, very regulated in the way that it is today.
And presumably you'd soak it in coffee.
Yeah, just double the high.
Right.
So that was the post-war period. Again, a lot of accepted licit drug use. The third period, roughly coincides with neoliberalism. So you get a new punitive attitude. This is the beginning of what I say in the book is the acute phase of the war on drugs. People oftentimes attribute the war on drugs to Nixon. I would say Nixon sort of doubles down on trends that had long predated him.
Yeah.
And you get the ballooning of the carceral system in this time. And then the final period in the book is just the one we're currently living through. I mean, I think that in a lot of ways, neoliberalism is falling apart. There are, broad social experiments and sort of what comes next. The tap of state spending has finally been turned on after a long time, but, with no real plan for how we fix this thing. And appropriately, there's drug decriminalization and legalization movements that are increasingly successful. And, I'm reticent to make predictions, or I am in the book to make predictions. But I can't help but see all of these trends just continuing in the next decade, especially in the psychedelic space, which we'll talk about in a second. I can see these things becoming increasingly mainstreamed in American society.
Right. Okay, so that's sort of the last thing I'm going to do to kind of lay the groundwork of what you're arguing is you helpfully in your introduction, you introduce us to 5 orienting claims that you want to make in the book. And these aren't particularly heavy-handed in the way that you deploy them, but they do kind of frame the argument. So this is essayistic in its presentation. It's not a set of hypotheses that are being proven and disproven sort of systematically. But so orienting claims. The first one is, and you can give me a little bit about each, about why you want to make these claims and what justifies them. The first one is work structures normal drug use into a dosing regimen. And this seems particularly important for understanding the relationship of drugs to society. Tell us a little bit about that.
Sure. I think human beings have used drugs for a long time, obviously. But the ways in which we've traditionally used drugs have differed quite markedly than I think how we're using them today. So, drugs were incorporated into different religious rituals. Drugs had a kind of social function. Drugs were, a great way to make agricultural work less boring, essentially. But today, what I want to say is that drug use, or accepted drug use, is increasingly fit into this paradigm where it's either about getting us up for the day so that we're more efficient at getting through our tasks. And obviously, there's a wide range of stimulants that are very useful for that purpose, or drugs that help us accommodate ourselves to our limited leisure time. So, and there's a wide range of drugs for that as well. And any drugs that don't fit that paradigm are typically the ones that are demonized or made illegal, right? So in the book, I talk about opiates, how, opiates have always chafed against this designation recreational. People do take opiates recreationally. People can, in some instances, take them safely recreationally. But they've traditionally chafed against that designation. So for that reason, I think that's, one of the reasons they've been a target of the American drug war.
Right. So we have this split in the drug regulatory regime or policing regime between drugs that sort of accommodate the functioning of day-to-day life in capitalist America, and those that don't. And so opiates lie outside of that.
Yeah, I think that's right. Though I guess I'm hesitant to make that division pharmacologically, because many drugs that are demonized in American society have very similar effects to drugs that are used for productive purposes. So, so methamphetamine itself is, chemically almost indistinguishable from amphetamine or dextroamphetamine. They're all part of the same sort of drug family. And methamphetamine has been used in the same way as amphetamine. I think it's still actually on the market, and I'm forgetting the brand name, like Dizoxin or something. Yet today, people think of meth as completely different than Adderall, even though they have very similar effects when used in pure form, right? Obviously, the route of administration, if you're using a dirty needle or something, it's going to have different effects. So I don't think that the division is necessarily pharmacological, but I think that it has to do with our cultural associations with the people who use those drugs. So it's drugs that are associated with unproductive people who are part of what social scientists sometimes call the surplus population, that are often demonized.
Okay, so that gets us to orienting claim number 4. We'll go back to 2 and 3, which is the difference between licit and illicit drugs is a class distinction.
Yep.
Yeah. So tell us a little bit about
that. I think in the official mythology, legal drugs are safe and illegal drugs are unsafe. And I don't think anyone actually believes that, even though that's the thing that we keep telling ourselves.
Yeah.
Traditionally in America, the reason that drugs have become illegal, or that they've become demonized in some way, is because they're associated with some particular group. So going back to the 19th century, opium in the Chinese, in the 1910s, cocaine and black stevedores in particular in the South. In the 30s, Mexicans and marijuana. Throughout the history of drugs, whenever there are drugs that are either demonized in popular discourse or made directly illegal, it's always because they're associated with some particular group that is not respectable or acceptable for whatever reason.
So not just class, to be clear. It could be other reasons too.
There are other reasons as well. Yeah.
But it is a line of respectable versus.
Yeah, those are the terms I use more in that section, just that there are acceptable drug users and unacceptable drug users. Right. And typically the unacceptable drug users are associated with some already marginalized and oppressed subgroup within American society.
Yeah. Okay. So psychopharmacology is the science of treating atomization, or perhaps alienation.
Yeah. So in the psychotropics chapter of the book, it's about psychiatric medications. It's about, a lot of different shifts in psychiatry, but the key one, I think, is happens in the 80s. People talk about it as the biological revolution in psychiatry.
Mm-hmm.
And before then, Americans were Americans were pretty open about the social causes of drug use. So you look at drug ads at the time, and they're pretty terrifying in a lot of respects. I include some drug ads in the book. But the justifications are like, are you stressed out about what's going on in Cuba and Czechoslovakia? Like, you should take Librium, like it'll take the edge off, like right. Stuff like that. Do you hate your job? Take Librium. Are you horrified by your domestic suburban cell that you live in? Take this drug, right? There are a whole range of drugs available to accommodate ourselves to the American experience, and it's horrifying looking at those ads in retrospect. But it's also fairly honest, right? Just about the sort of social imperatives involved. After the biological revolution in psychiatry, people increasingly started talking about different neurotransmitter mechanisms or different brain dysfunctions as the reason that we take psychiatric medications. And I don't think that's necessarily wrong. Of course, the actions of our brains influence how we act and how we engage the world. It's just that it's so narrowing of the justifications for drug consumption that it leaves out all this other stuff. And so when I make that claim that psychopharmacology is the science of treating atomization, part of the point is to bring back in the social reference that when we're taking drugs of any kind, the kinds of social conditions and imperatives that we're living in greatly impact why and how much we're taking drugs.
And by that, I would think you're also talking about social norms, right? So it's also an imperative to go along with social norms in a way which can be very difficult or contradictory for people. And the drugs, in some cases, the drugs are meant to help you. So coping is not just about society in the sense that society is a difficult thing for us. It's also that we have normative expectations to function well in society, right? Which can be hard for people. That's part of what alienation atomization is, right?
Yeah, and I mean, honestly, I think that talking about it at that level would be a more helpful way to do it. Because the way in which it's talked about is not that people struggle to meet certain social norms, which would open a conversation about what those social norms are and whether we should meet them in the first place. But it's rather about, some particular serotonin deficiency or a serotonin reuptake mechanism, right? In which case it's not necessarily wrong, right? But it's limiting of the kinds of justifications for drug use in such a way that it just leaves out this whole part of the conversation that would be useful.
Well, it becomes an individual pathology rather than a social pathology, right? Yeah, okay. So just a reminder for people, if you'd like to pose questions to Ben Fong, just put them in the chat and in the Q&A, and we will get to them at some point during the conversation. So please do that. I'm sure Ben would like to hear from you. All right, so orienting claim, drug producers are typical capitalist organizations.
Yeah, I mean, I think that in the case of both big pharma and big illicit drug operations, people oftentimes think that these are particularly seedy operations. I'm not going to say otherwise, right? It's fun to pick on the Sackler family.
It is.
That being said, the pharmaceutical industry, it's highly regulated and it sells very powerful and addictive psychoactive chemicals, and I think that's the reason for its profit. But its basic mechanisms are just sort of what any corporation does, right? It lobbies and sometimes bribes politicians. It makes extravagant claims about its products, right? It does all it can to sort of ensure sort of market dependency. So, in that sense, I think big pharma, its insidiousness is just in being a capitalist enterprise rather than something that would be under state control, for instance. In the case of illegal drug operations, I think this is where the sort of like popular fantasies are really stoked, right? You see shows like The Wire and Breaking Bad and Narcos and whatnot, and you just think that the whole thing is perpetrated by a kind of or pervaded by a kind of like evil and corruption and violence and whatnot. For the most part, the illegal drug trade works on trust, right? It wouldn't be so lucrative if it were violent all the time.
Yeah.
Like violence is very useful in certain instances, but for the most part,
Capturing markets.
Right, capturing markets. Like so Pablo Escobar, who's I think most associated in the popular imaginary with the violence of the drug trade,
Yeah.
like he sort of like rose to power by coming up with this particular insurance scheme that protected cocaine shipments out of Colombia. Like it's not glamorous stuff, right? He just like did the numbers and worked it out in the right way. So it's just business at that level. And what violence there is in the trade is it's all very calculated, right? I mean, I think that most people involved in that trade are very suspicious of people who are just violent for no reason. They want violence to be executed in such a way that it is useful to their business, that it drives away competitors, that it shows the usefulness of certain people at certain key nodes in the distributional channels, right? It's all a market logic at that level, right? It's what happens to market logic when it's driven underground.
Okay. Well, and the violence for market capture as a specific analogy. I mean, probably the most famous example wasn't any particular drug dealer; it was the British East India Company, right?
Right.
Right. Okay. So Escobar of Medellin, blossoming insurance conglomerate. Right. Got it. I find that helpful. I think that. One of the, you're pretty evocative in this account for this particular argument that, that even illegal drug operations are in some ways more pure forms of capitalist enterprise. Yeah. They're not in the sense that they're devoid of violence, because they aren't, but explain like what makes them even perhaps more pure than other kinds of capitalist enterprise.
Yeah. I mean, the way in which drug journalists often end up talking about their subjects, it's pretty fascinating, and they're often quite like self-reflective about this as well, right? They like think about their subjects as like the ultimate rugged individual, like making a name for themselves, right? And in that sense, they're the sort of like proto homo economicus, like out like on their own, right? They don't have the support of the state. In fact, like the state is after them, right? And so they're sort of the sort of proto capitalists, like on their own, making their way. I mean, I'm thinking of a number of people right now, Philippe Bourgois, Sam Quinones, like people who write about like the drug trade. They oftentimes just stop and say, there's nothing glamorous here. They're just like, these are principles you could learn in business school that they're just that they're operating on.
Okay. So the final orienting claim: drug policy is not about drugs.
One of Nixon's advisors, I'm forgetting his deputy something or other, John Ehrlichman, he made this claim, or he related this to a journalist in the 90s, so well after he was out of power. He said something along, I'm going to butcher the quote, but he said something along the lines of like, okay, who were our political enemies in the Nixon administration? Well, it was Black people and the New Left. You can't make it illegal to be Black. You can't make it illegal to be on the New Left, but you can associate those groups with different kinds of drugs, demonize those drugs, make those drugs illegal, and then marginalize those groups by that means. Obviously a startling claim in a lot of ways, but I think he was kind of just telling us what we already knew, which is that when people are legislating about drugs or drumming up different drug scares, they're oftentimes thinking about other kinds of social problems and certain social groups that they think need to be fixed in some way.
Right. And so to be clear, if it's not about drugs, what is it about?
It's about the kinds of social ills that follow from capitalist society. Just going back to the temperance movement for a second. When it's easy to see an organization like the Women's Christian Temperance Union, for instance, as a thoroughly contradictory middle-class organization. In many ways, it did set the stage for later like feminist struggles, but On the other hand, it was a thoroughly confused, paternalistic movement. That being said, the kinds of things that they had in their sites were real social problems, right? There were new, with urbanization in a newly industrialized society, you got forms of drinking that were really pernicious, right? Like, and it was very visible as well. They could go down to the saloon and see a kind of degeneracy that they just weren't used to, right? It was, sure, it was particular subgroups that were doing the drinking, and that's partially why they were offended. So a lot of like immigrant Catholics, Irish, Italians, essentially, right? It offended the Protestant mindset. But it was also, a new form of hard escapist drinking. So Americans have always drunk alcohol, but it used to be incorporated into the day. It sort of followed the rhythm of a slower agricultural ethos. When factory workers in the late 19th century got off work and they went to the saloon, they got hammered in a way that was qualitatively new. And so there was a visible ill that they thought that they were addressing, right? And but the question is like, well, what do you do about that? Like when you see a form of alcohol abuse that is qualitatively new, is it just that there are certain individuals that are using alcohol in the wrong ways, or is it because they're just not used to the rhythms of factory life, and we need to actually mitigate the effects of factory life on them so that they don't feel like they need to engage in escapist drinking? I think these are the two sort of paths available to us when we talk about drug policy. You're either focusing on particularly degenerate individuals and institutions that need to be eliminated or curbed, versus thinking about the kinds of things that lead to that degeneracy in the first place.
Yeah. And it's important to note, I mean, your historical account is helpful because some of these debates for some of the drugs you discuss happened long ago, and they're not as actively debated today. And even with alcohol, I mean, I'm thinking about Hogarth Prince from the late 18th century, and, he was drawing pictures of the degeneracy of drunkenness. But of course, the English didn't discover alcohol in 1785. It had been around for a long time. What he was upset about was gin.
Hard alcohol in particular.
A very specific, cheap, hard alcohol.
There's a great the illustration that you're referencing now of Gin Alley, where it's all degeneracy. And then on Beer Street, everyone's happy, they're rotund, they're having a good time.
Right. Yeah, and I guess the beer brewers have retain that in their advertising.
And also, I mean, it wasn't totally common knowledge that beer and liquor contained the same substance until the early 18th century. So it took a while for people to sort of realize that, oh, these are actually the same substance. Like it's like opium and morphine, like you're dealing with the same kind of substance. For a long time, the cultural associations between liquor and beer and wine, on the other hand, they were so disparate that people thought that they were just different substances in a lot of ways.
Yeah. And, a substance that we don't normally think of in these terms, you talk about the early debates when coffee was introduced into Western Europe and Britain in particular, which had some very amusing debates about whether coffee was good or bad for you. But also, I think a lot of other substances they've introduced like that, there's a kind of panic about what it might do versus the way it can be destabilizing or undermine loosely what I think back then you would refer to as like moral fiber or character, right?
No, at the time that coffee was introduced to Western Europe, like a whole bunch of other psychoactive substances were as well, like tea, chocolate, and whatnot. And people just didn't know what to do with the substances exactly, right? They like the cultural connotations around them were totally new. People didn't really hadn't settled on particular forms in which to take them. There's a great chapter of Wolfgang Schimmelbusch's book, Taste of Paradise, of this, where he talks about like the attitudes of the new coffee drinkers towards chocolate drinking in Spain. I was like, oh, those silly Spanish, they're drinking chocolate in the mornings.
Right, madness.
But these were all new practices. They were like figuring out how to take these substances.
Well, I think sugar generally. I mean, I think it's also a stimulant. It's one that you don't actually discuss, but
if the book were longer, I think a chapter on sugar would have been great. Talking about different behavioral addictions, or the whole discourse around behavioral addictions. And the chapter that I really wanted to include, if I had more time, would be a chapter about non-psychoactive drugs, which are really kind of the most interesting ones and definitely the most profitable in America. So like statins, cholesterol medication, arthritis medication, all the medications that speak to an aging population, like they're the big sellers.
Yeah, right. Okay. So let's dig in a little bit on a couple of these. And so, one that I wanted to dig in on, and maybe we can draw a contrast with the other if that works. But one is the drug that you say is actually declining in use, which is cocaine.
Yep.
And then the other two that sort of come to mind is particularly interesting for this current moment, psychotropics and psychedelics. So let's talk a little about their trajectory relative to each other in this moment and how your thesis explains some of this trajectory.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, cocaine's in the appendix of the book. I go over different active and it's sort of a misleading chart in a lot of ways because I'm oftentimes comparing apples to oranges. But I just wanted to get some sense of like, okay, like when some drugs were going up in use, like what was happening to other drugs. I just want to sort of see it over time. And definitely the most interesting part of the chart is just the way in which the cocaine line intersects with others, right? So after the Controlled Substances Act in 1970, you get a drop in amphetamine consumption and benzodiazepine consumption and marijuana consumption. And at the same time, you just get this huge influx of Andean cocaine, right? It's just cocaine sort of just crosses all of these other drugs going down. And then cocaine stays high in its usage throughout the neoliberal period. And then it begins to drop down just as all these other drugs are sort of taking off. So it's sort of, yeah, it's a very interesting drug in that respect. Like where most drugs zig, it zags in terms of consumption. And it's not that it's, so cocaine, I think globally is actually enjoying something of a renaissance. It's just no longer Americans who are the predominant consumers of it. So around, I'm forgetting if it was like around like 2005, I think it was, overall cocaine imports drastically dropped in the United States. Yeah. So the peak in terms of users of cocaine was, I think, like 82 or 83. And after that, it goes down pretty severely. However, overall cocaine shipment stays pretty high through the 2000s. And that just indicates that, it was particular users that were, it was no longer a culturally pervasive phenomenon. It was now cocaine, like people addicted to cocaine who were predominantly using it. So, but around the mid 2000s, it really drops precipitously in use, and it hasn't really recovered. I've seen a lot of different accounts of why that might be. There's an article, I'm forgetting where it's from, but it's called Uncle Sam's Cocaine Nosedive. And basically people don't understand why it happened. Like there's all sorts of different things, but one of the big ones is just that global consumption has really taken off. Like there's different avenues to sort of ship the cocaine out to. So it's no longer just the Americans who are consuming it all. Right. In the 80s, it very much was us.
Yeah. And what about psychotropics and psychedelics in their trajectory?
Yeah, I mean, I mentioned the biological revolution in psychiatry, and I mean, I would say that changed a lot about how Americans think about psychiatric drug use, like why we're taking drugs. Like I think neurobiological explanations are very useful in a lot of immediate ways for making sense of our experience. If you think of yourself as having a particular neurotransmitter deficiency and a particular drug is correcting that, then problem solved, right? It's a really helpful explanatory paradigm for a lot of people. But I think that in occluding the social reference, it's had a kind of regressive effect on drug discourses. But that being said, I think that psychiatry, for various reasons of the incentives of drug development, it just doesn't have very good tools available to it. So there's a digression in the psychotropics chapter about Prozac. In the 90s, Prozac and other SSRIs were promised to be the future of drugs, right? It was no longer these dirty drugs that just affected your whole sort of like your whole being. It was now that we were going to target drugs to specific reuptake mechanisms that would allow us a kind of like surgical precision with drugs. Right. In addition, one benefit of Prozac, Zoloft, and others is that they don't make us immediately high. Right. And for a variety of reasons, like people don't like drugs that make you immediately high. They make you feel better eventually, but the effects take a while to sort of to happen. So that was the promise of Prozac. I think that we're now at a point where everyone kind of realizes that those promises were empty, essentially. That like from the beginning, their makers knew that they weren't that effective, right? That, you know, in randomized clinical trials, you can conduct as many trials as you want. You only need 2 successful ones to get a drug to market. And so they ran lots of different tests showing that Prozac's not that effective compared to a placebo, but they don't need to advertise that stuff, right? Like in marketing Prozac. In addition, Prozac has all sorts of other sort of deleterious consequences. So really, I think this psychiatric paradigm is kind of at an impasse. You know, it's traditional models, like people sort of see through them in you know, increasingly. I think that's really one of the things that's giving rise to the psychedelic renaissance and the turn to new kinds of drugs that might treat anxiety, depression, PTSD, the kinds of forms of everyday suffering that psychiatrists deal with. And you know, for all the reasons that I just said, just given the sort of decrepit state of psychiatry, I do think that the psychedelic stuff is going to take off in the next decade. That MDMA, psilocybin, LSD, maybe after that, that these are all going to be mainstreamed only because we're living through such an intense mental health crisis, and people are going to want things that actually work for them.
So the drug of the moment, is it marijuana or psychedelics?
I mean, I'd have to go with the so the psychedelic stuff is definitely the most interesting. Like with marijuana, I mean, the story around marijuana is kind of boring at a certain point. I mean, it's just like, so not that marijuana can't be used in a detrimental fashion, but it's just about the safest drug that you could possibly imagine, right? I mean, compared to alcohol, compared to cigarettes, right? It's just like, it is for the most part fine. And yet throughout American history, just wild claims have been made about marijuana. And we're at this point where I think that just, you know, that we're at this, we're in this stage of contradiction with marijuana, where it's practically legal and normalized in a lot of places and still illegal and very much demonized in others. And I would be surprised. I mean, there's a lot of talk about descheduling marijuana right now. I would be very surprised if Biden does it. It's just like not the kind of political football he like wants to deal with. Yeah. And it's not a high priority voting issue either. And so he can say all the right things about marijuana, but without actually descheduling it, which he could do with the stroke of his pen. Does not require congressional legislation to deschedule marijuana. Any day now, Joe Biden could sit down with a piece of paper and deschedule marijuana. Right. But he's not going to do it. Yeah. So I guess like the story about marijuana, it's fairly simple and straightforward, and the contradictions are apparent. With psychedelics, a lot of stuff is happening really quickly, to the point where, you know, like I can't even make sense of some of the Google alerts I get about psychedelics because I don't understand all the developments that sort of preceded that. So it's happening really quickly. In many liberal urban centers, it's sort of already normalized. You know, like people have offered me like psilocybin, you know, like doctors, lawyers, like people who I would never, you know, expect to offer me drugs. Like, they're like, hey, do you want to try this? And like, why do you have that? You know, it's become normalized in certain places. That's just really qualitatively new. And I can only see that trend continuing, and I can only see the medicalization trend continuing as well. From the evidence that I've seen, psilocybin, MDMA, LSD, these are drugs that promise to help people with anxiety, depression, PTSD, other conditions in a way that the current psychiatric medications just won't. And I think for that reason alone, like they're going to become mainstreamed in a new and very surprising way.
So if these become typical of the dosing regime, of the, you know, requirements of capitalist functioning, of, you know, the orienting claims you have about what we need to know to understand all of this, you know, what are some other substances that people have used to feel good that are not taken up and that don't become sort of pervasive in the culture? And I think it's important to understand that they're like, the realm of possibility is not what we have, right? It's,
for sure.
Yeah. So let's talk a little bit about about that realm of possibility. And before you do, though, let me just remind people to please put questions in the chat. We'll be getting them very shortly. Yeah, please put it in there. I'm sure Ben would be happy to answer them. Yeah.
Well, yeah, I mean, there's two different directions to go there. Like, one is that there's all sorts of social drugs like kava, betel nut, coca leaves that are just not they're not pervasive in American society. And they're pretty good. I mean, they're mild forms of, like, stimulants or depressants that are that in a more rational drug using society, I think would be, at least like on the market and available. As we proceed away from the acute phase of the war on drugs and these decriminalization and legalization movements become more successful, I think we'll see a lot of these things begin to reappear. So kratom, for instance, is one substance that you'll like see around a lot. And that's a very recent phenomenon. It's the last decade. I never saw kratom anywhere before for the last decade. But the other component of this is that in the psychedelic space, there are a potentially infinite number of substances out there. I mean, the possibilities of organic chemistry, it's not just psilocybin, MDMA, LSD, like those are the most commonly known ones. There are a whole range of wild substances with names that, like, I've never heard of, that are out there and people are experimenting with. And as these other drugs enter the mainstream, I think some of these other drugs will start to enter popular consciousness as like boutique alternatives to them, right? So if psilocybin isn't working for you, you can try 2CB or whatever. I think that all these drugs are slowly going to seep into not popular consciousness necessarily, but for people who are interested, they will become more available. There's a website called erowid.org. It looks like the kind of website where you'd like instantly get a virus if you click on anything. It's that kind of website. But it's a website of self-described psychonauts who catalog all of their experiences taking these wide range of substances. They're people who are, friends of Sasha Shulgin and whatnot, who have access to all sorts of things that, like, I will probably never see in my lifetime. And they're trying these things out and they're reporting their experiences. They're saying, like, at this dose it does this, at this dose it does this. And again, like, they're pretty comprehensive in cataloging all the things they try. I would guess that 98% of the substances listed on that site I've never heard of.
Yeah.
So it's a really, potentially infinite market there.
Okay. So I'm a little bit conscious of time. So I want to expand on this as one of the sort of concluding points that you make, which I think is kind of alarming. Given the money behind it, given the social need, given the various ways that Americans want to feel good in ways that can be satisfied by the pharmaceutical industry or other business enterprise. You claim towards the end that, whatever our panics were about whatever drugs have come along before, given all of the money, resources, technology behind this kind of thing, what we're gonna see is going to be a lot worse.
It's going to be
problematic, to not be judgmental about it. Tell us a little about how you anticipate this is going to play out.
Problematic. Yeah. I mean, so it is problematic from a political perspective. You could say from a broadly social perspective, in playing to and reinforcing trends of atomization, certainly. I don't want to be too dismissive, though. I think a lot of people are going to be helped by these drugs.
Okay.
A lot of people are going to be helped by these drugs. And just in general, I mean, the title of the book, Quick Fixes, I think it's really easy to sort of look down on a quick fix. But as someone who goes on YouTube and, like, searches for home repair, like, options, DIY home repair options, like, a quick fix is a good fix.
Yeah.
Sometimes it's the best fix to have.
Yeah.
I think the question, though, ultimately is just like how many quick fixes you can stitch together and still have like a viable structure, And I think we're reaching a point in the United States where, putting people on MDMA and psilocybin is not necessarily going to solve our problems. That Instead of that, we could consider, for instance, like fixing our failing healthcare system.
Right.
Given that so much of drug consumption in America is a form of self-care, if there were actual care options available to people, if we universalized healthcare, we might not see the same kinds of compulsions towards drug use. So, I think that what I want to keep open at the end of the day is that broader social reference, and the idea that we could imagine political and social fixes to the problems we associate with drug consumption, and that we don't just need to think about individual fixes to our problems.
Right. Okay. So let's just on your final note. I mean, you're concluding Mark's remarks to have a positive story to conclude your book with, which you always should have. You make a set of claims about how to deal with this, and interestingly, none of them really involve drug regulation.
Yeah.
So the first thing I'll say to orient this is, which I really like, is you say that drugs just aren't that good as quick fixes. And that's interesting because I think, as you point out many times in the book, people's experiences with drugs are often very positive. Drugs can be fun, they make you feel good, all that kind of stuff. So when you say drugs just aren't that good, you're not denying that experience. What are you trying to say?
I think drugs are excellent at doing certain things.
Mm-hmm.
I think that they're oftentimes inflated to be the prime mover of certain social problems, or the key to happiness in life, in such a way that is misleading. So you get, on the one hand, just wild claims of drug enthusiasm out there, like you just need to find this one substance that will finally make you happy, right? The one weird trick to finally be successful and happy in life. And on the other hand, you get these extremely dystopian accounts of drug use, right? That we're all sort of like numbing ourselves, or we're just floating around in our own tubs of butter thanks to these different psychoactive medications. And I think that both sides of that fantasy are just not correct, right? Like, drugs are very useful, they're very efficient at delivering on the promise of fun, but like when it comes to larger questions of like life's meaning, right, like discovering a purpose in life and finding the kinds of conditions under which you will lead like a flourishing life, drugs just aren't going to give that to you. And similarly, they're not going to result in totalitarian regimes of mind control either. Like we tried that with MK Ultra, it didn't work. And so the kinds of both the fantasies behind both drug enthusiasm and drug prohibitionism, I want to say they're just that, they're fantasies. The drugs are very good for doing all sorts of things for us, and we should appreciate both the benefits and the harms that they actually cause. But we shouldn't inflate them into prime movers of anything. They're not going to fix our problems, and they're not the source of our problems.
So you talked, and just to conclude, you talked a little bit about one thing that you think is actually a solution that addresses it. But
yeah,
I just want to hit on, and that is a better healthcare system. And in fact, I don't think it's true of all drugs, but there certainly are some drugs which are specifically being used to deal with the failures of the healthcare system. Not true of all, but some, and mental health system as well. But the two other things that you point to are a better moral and physical infrastructure, and better quality of work.
Yep.
Yeah. So let's just talk a little bit about what you mean by those and why you think those are better solutions than trying to just deal with it as a drug problem.
Yeah, just delving into the drug literature a little bit. One thing that a lot of people agree on is just the importance of the regularity of work to drug use. That like if you are working regularly and at a job that you are not totally miserable at, then that tends to stave off problematic forms of drug use, right? There's a certain regularity to work. And this is why we often hear about the drug use of the fabulously rich and the very poor, right? Like people who are not who don't work regularly.
Right.
And providing meaningful work at a time when much meaningful work is needed to, as you said, repair the physical infrastructure of modern America, Yeah, I mean, I think that just giving that meaning to people as we did through jobs programs and the New Deal, it would, it would give people a kind of purpose and meaning to their lives that they're seeking otherwise through drug consumption. Yeah, and then on the moral infrastructure point, I think it is the sort of statistics around American loneliness today are pretty shocking, right? I think there's a recent poll that said 15% of men in America report having no close friends whatsoever. It's, we're at this moment where all of the kinds of social institutions that used to ground associational life, they've all collapsed, like unions, fraternal organizations, et cetera. And so, we're really left on our own in a lot of new ways. And I think part of rebuilding that moral infrastructure is finding new kinds of associations that people can be a part of. And so I think part of the uptick in interest in unions, for instance, is that people are coming to understand that unions allow them to have material control over their work environment in ways that they don't without them. But part of being in unions is just like having people that you relate to on an interpersonal level. And I think that unions are certainly a fix to a lot of economic problems in America, but I think they'd also be fixes to social problems as well. That the social lives that unions used to offer, it's one benefit that we don't often talk about. We talk about material benefits, but just moving to a new town and having a union local to go to, or like a fraternal lodge to go to. These are things that people used to take for granted and are no longer in existence.
So, well, actually, let's stop there. We're going to turn to questions. So this is one more reminder. If you have questions, so please put them in the chat. We'll be taking your questions now for the rest of our time. The first question that I want to pose to you comes from Sandra. And she asked, do you think energy drinks could be found as the new street drug?
Energy drinks are it's pretty powerful stuff, actually. That market is pretty wild. I wanted to look into that a little bit more. I don't think it needs to be a street drug because you can buy it legally. Yeah. But no, I was doing a podcast interview the other day, and the host admitted to drinking like just copious amounts of Red Bull. And I was like, oh, how much are you drinking? And he showed me this can of Red Bull that looked like it was a half-gallon can of Red Bull. Like the kinds of energy drinks that are being created today are wild. What's interesting about the energy drink market is the way in which they're starting to expand into what you might call speedballs. So drinks that both offer the caffeine as well as other different kinds of things to make you feel a certain way. And that kind of thing, I mean, not as a street drug, but as a regularly available consumer product, I can see that kind of thing expanding more and more. So that market of other kinds of substances that we talked about a second ago, kava, betel nut, like not coca probably anytime soon, but other kinds of substances, I could see those being incorporated into energy drinks and offering in the creation of different niche markets for people who don't just want something to wake up for the day, but who want something to like drink along with alcohol and whatnot.
So a question from Rebecca, which I think is interesting in that it's pushing back a little against the idea that this is all a problem of loss or atomization. So she's really asking about, well, doesn't some of this get incubated in various kinds of associational, even if they're mediated associational settings? So she's thinking about how social media drives the uptake in drugs, how college campuses can drive the uptake in drugs. And then relatedly, Sandra wants to know about the relationship between poverty levels and the take-up of different kinds of drugs. And there the question is really about accessibility of the drug, things like that. But these are alternative hypotheses for why the drugs are being taken up. So
right, yeah. I mean, so we talked about this a little bit earlier, but you can't just blanketly reduce drug consumption patterns to like imperatives of capitalist society. Like capitalists can profit off of new forms of socialization as they can profit off of new forms of atomization. So it's not that simple. I would say though that the trends all point in the direction of increasingly individualized drug use, and it's not that the social settings don't exist, but the trends have been away from them. And I don't think that there's any more like stark illustration of this fact than what drinking cultures used to be like in America. I mean, it's like frat house life writ large, essentially. Like, it was a really intense form of social obligation, right? Like, involving the buying of drinks, the reciprocating of drinks, sort of akin to what Marcel Mauss used to call the gift economy.
Yep.
There were social rights bound up in alcohol consumption that are now just no longer there, right? Like, I can go out to a bar with friends, and if I don't feel like drinking, I won't drink and they won't shun me, right? If I don't like a particular drink, I'll express that preference and not have that drink, right? All these new kinds of things that we do in social spaces, they indicate the individualization of drug use, right? We might be doing things together, but there's no longer the same kind of social obligation bound up in it. And I think that that's sort of what I mean when I say that the trends are all moving away from socialization towards atomization. If it's not people taking drugs in their apartments by themselves, it's people, tailoring their particular individual drug use in social settings. I met someone the other day who was interested in starting a new nightclub, and he was against alcohol. So he had problems with alcoholism in his family. And so there's no alcohol to be served, but he just wanted different psychedelic combinations, like, on order, right? So you could go and just try out different proprietary combinations of psychedelics, no alcohol in the bar. Yeah. And it's a new form of sociality. And I think he's to be lauded in thinking through potential market possibilities in the future. And the way in which alcohol has organized our social lives for so long, yeah, I mean, it's problematic in itself. I don't necessarily think that means, though, that like the new forms of drug use necessarily offer new kinds of sociality. And in fact, they seem to go in the other direction. It's about self-optimizing your own particular brand of what you want, rather than consuming drugs for particularly social purposes.
I mean, so just expanding on this a little bit, I'm thinking about a couple of other examples. One is the curated acid trip, which is like a thing in coastal cities and stuff.
Yeah, I mean, this is
20 people in a room, they all drop acid, but it's not actually social. You're supposed to go entirely interior, and talk and think about and talk about yourself, not actually interact with others, which is very different from a kind of the way acid is sometimes taken in other settings, or the rave where people take Molly and ecstasy. They're all doing the drug together. Does that fit that?
I mean, the interesting thing about the current psychedelic moment is that it's very suspicious and sometimes actively hostile to the old psychedelic moment. So current psychedelic researchers, they're like, Tim Leary and the counterculture, they ruined everything. They ruined everything. We had these amazing drugs in the 50s. Psychotherapists knew about their therapeutic potential. And then Leary and the rest got a hold of them and they just ruined it, right? Like, they're the reason why Prohibition came. So they're very hostile to that. And in some senses, you can be like, okay, yeah, like maybe the hippies were annoying in certain ways, right? But they did have a kind of democratic ethos to drug taking, right? It was about some kind of liberatory experience that was done for everyone, right? There was a proselytizing element to that. Today, it's very much, there's a managerial ethos to psychedelics, right? It's Silicon Valley tech executives taking it, and they think they're fine taking it because they're good, responsible individuals. And on the medical side, it's this very curated process, right? It's highly regulated, first of all. So the Oregon model of psilocybin usage, for instance, you can't buy psilocybin directly. You have to go through, I forget what they call it. I think it's like a mushroom guide or something. You have to go through a professional who will curate the experience for you. And this is new, right? This new kind of like professional shamanic ethos of the psychedelic culture. It's not about like, democratizing drugs. It's not about like, getting everyone to have an acid experience and sort of free their minds. It's about, carefully controlling the use of these things so that we don't end up with the old counterculture.
So on this theme, Alexis says that she's interested in the turn from social causes to individualized pathology in psychiatry, and certainly in psychology probably also. But she wants to know about incentives and motivations within the profession that lead to this. But then also, I mean, I'm sure there is an account of transformations in the profession that leads to this
Like
outcome.
for therapists, for psychiatrists, like
Well, no, thinking about things as problems of the individual rather than like social psychology would originally think about the problems of society more broadly as well. And they think about how collectives were responding to things. And but so the individualized pathology in psychiatry sort of emerging as a more and more important thing. Do you dig into that sort of question, the way that psychiatry as a profession works and things like that?
I don't in the book, but there's a direct material incentive behind the biological revolution in psychiatry, which is that psychiatrists could all of a sudden see a whole lot more patients than they used to. So I mean, this is interesting because in the old psychoanalytic models that used to be dominant in psychiatry, where talk therapy was the thing, that was still focused on individual pathology, right? But it was focused on one's life history, one's relationship to your parents, right? Like it was talking through your problems in a way that could include a social reference, could include talking about capitalism or American society or whatnot, but was also individualizing in a way. But what the biological revolution supplied was a way to cut down on those hour-long sessions 5 times a week, right? And just rather see patients in 15-minute increments where you can say, oh, like how's Prozac treating you, right? Good, bad, do you want to try a different drug? Okay, great, next person. It just allowed psychiatrists to sort of see more people. From the insurance company perspective, also great to be reimbursing for maintenance medications rather than very expensive talk therapy, right? So there were material incentives behind it, very, very much so. And yeah, I mean, but it's not like all of a sudden people stopped talking about social issues and began talking about individual issues. But I would argue that the psychoanalytic mode that psychiatry used to be in, it was more helpful for at least developing some holistic version of people's mental health struggles. Whereas once it's just about norepinephrine and serotonin, then you just lose this whole like way of talking about human interiority that can be quite damaging, I think.
Right. So Tori wants to know about the relationship to my favorite dystopian novel about this, which is Brave New World. And she wonders how this science fiction may be integrated into the discussion here in that it ties drugs to capitalism's core. What do you think about that association, which I'm sure is a very natural one for people who've read Brave New World?
Yeah, there's all sorts of like film portrayals of that kind of dystopia as well. One thing that's often never mentioned in the discussion of Brave New World is that Huxley wrote a later book called Island, where it's essentially Brave New World, except it's happy. It's like, this is actually good. And so you can kind of read it both ways, right? Like people sort of medicating themselves just to sort of like cope with what's around them, as something potentially liberatory, maybe, as it's again, quick fixes are real fixes, right? They allow us to go along with what's happening around us. I wanted to delve more into like the science fiction aspect, but it sort of all came down to extreme versions of either the drug enthusiast fantasy or the drug prohibitionist fantasy. And so I do deal with it in the conclusion, just like, hey, here are some examples of films and novels that you can look to find these kinds of discourses, but they're all just exaggerated versions of how people already talk about drugs. Like the science fiction is in the prohibitionists and enthusiast fantasies themselves.
Yeah, and as we discussed, you specifically don't want to go down the tracks of that discussion.
Well, I think it's interesting. I think it's, so the drug war is just, it doesn't make any sense. It doesn't make any sense. It hasn't made sense from the beginning. There's a psychologist at Columbia, Carl Hart, who says the drug war is something that only like children or extremely naive people could believe in, right? It's a failure on its own terms, right? You cannot stop drug production, distribution. You can't intimidate addicts out of their addiction, right? Like, there's just things that you can't do. You can make drugs less pure. You can move drug distribution channels around, right? But you're not going to stem drug production and consumption in the United States. In addition, it's just, born all of these like perverse consequences as well. So like, why are we doing this wildly irrational thing? And that's where I do think the fantasies are kind of interesting. I think that some people think that drugs are the danger, that like drugs are the thing that are stopping us from being some, productivist utopia or whatever. I mean, with Prohibition, I think these are the fantasies that were articulated. Like, people came out after Prohibition passed and they were like, our jails will be free of inmates. Like, our children will all walk down the street smiling. Like, everything is going to be perfect if we just get rid of demon rum and the associated problems. And that's how people think about drugs in urban environments. Like, if we could just get rid of the drugs, then everything would be okay. And again, I think it's one of those fantasies that we should just be like, it doesn't actually hold up, right? Drugs are not that bad. They're not that good either. And so this fantasy of just being totally overtaken by drug consumption in such a way as to ruin everything good about American society, it's just that, it's a fantasy.
Yeah, and important to keep in mind that not only are drugs not that bad, they're also not that good.
Yeah.
And it's not that they're not problematic in some ways, right? Okay, so Ben would like to know, a different Ben.
Yeah, okay.
One of the many Bens running about.
Yeah.
Is curious about performance enhancing drugs in athletics and the accompanying moral debates and regulation. In some ways, this seems like it could be a problematic case for your thesis. In some ways, it's very simple, but the idea that well, I don't know. You answer the question.
In sports, it grates against like ideas of fairness, right? Like that it's a form of cheating, essentially. One could imagine, and I do wonder if we're going to get there, different kinds of leagues where drug taking is actively encouraged, right? Because then it would be fair. If everyone was on the drugs, then everyone hits a home run every time it passes. You could imagine that kind of thing in the future, where as long as there's some level playing field, it's like, so in sports, I think it's essentially about like the level playing field, right? Whether or not people are cheating. But no, I mean, the history of amphetamines is really the history of performance enhancement. We mainly know amphetamine in the form of Adderall to be a mental performance enhancer. Right. But it's been marketed as a physical performance enhancer as well. So a lot of cyclists, for instance, like had major health issues because they were all taking amphetamines, because amphetamines, just as they get you up to sort of like prepare for tests in college or whatnot, they can also like help you perform better on the field. And amphetamines really, I want to say, inaugurated a dream that we're still trying to realize, that the military in particular is still trying to realize. So they are really interested in finding some drug that is the peak physical performance enhancer. And recently there are all these new sort of nootropic kind of drugs. There's this one called modafinil that has been used by the Air Force. And modafinil, the promise is that it keeps you up, it keeps you alert, right? You can stay in the cockpit for like 3 days or whatever. And then you only need a normal night's rest to recover for the next day. So with amphetamines, you get really jittery, you get overexcited, you need like a long recovery period. The hope is to develop some kind of performance enhancement drug that keeps you up for a long time and you don't need the sort of normal recovery period. And I think soldiers have been kept up on modafinil for like 85 hours straight. Like they pushed sleep deficit boundaries to make efficient pilots, essentially.
Okay. Let's see. How much time do we have? So Rashad says, from the conversation, it seems that drugs are a metaphor for other discussions. And he specifically wants to know what drugs say about our built environment, particularly our cities. Is there something about our physical landscape that is informed by drugs?
That is informed by drugs. I mean, if we go to like the example of like crack, for instance, crack was often talked about as an epidemic. It was not an epidemic. It was highly localized in particular places, right? Epidemics, they spread all over the place.
Right.
Crack, it was very much localized in particular degraded urban environments, and they took over. They weren't just centers of crack use; they were centers of crack economies, right? Like these informal illegal economies filled in where legitimate economic activity should be. And so I don't think it's a mistake that you often see visible drug scourges that are advertised in the news and whatnot as in places that are extremely economically depressed in major urban locales. It's a result of lacking some sort of broader economic activity in those particular areas.
So the last question is coming from me. And I'm thinking about a conversation that we had at a center event when Jennifer Silva came to visit us. And, your story is kind of one where the real story is capitalism and our relationship to it. Drugs are sort of where we can see some of these dynamics more clearly, and things like that. She's talking about the way drug economies become the basis for the moral evaluation of economic activity. In that sense, it's more like the drug economy is the central part, and then people use that to understand economies generally. So I'm wondering what you think about that idea and that thesis. I'm pretty sure it was something that you were interested in when she said it, but tell me a little about what you think about that argument.
I mean, it's such a concern of poor and working class people in America, and one of the points of disconnect, I think, with liberal drug reformers that the sort of incentives of SSI, for instance, in promoting ADHD diagnoses, right? There's a lot of ambivalence throughout that. The effect of opioids and methamphetamine in these communities, it's like, there's a lot of fear around that, and there's a lot of like hatred of the kinds of policies that have led to it to become an epidemic. So those immediate concerns are very real. Ask the second part of the question now that I was going to address.
Well, right. So if your book is very much about capitalism and our relationship to it as much as it is about drugs, where drugs can be a window into capitalism. She's almost doing the opposite thing, which is that the way people evaluate drugs becomes the way that they get a window into economic activity generally.
Right, exactly. And that was the other part I was going to say. Like in teaching a class on drugs in America for many years at ASU now, I've been really struck by that fact that the way in which that like getting into discussing drug economies and drug discourses, students are often able to think about broader social structures in a way that they wouldn't otherwise, and to articulate their ambivalence about drug use and drug production in such a way that they're led to forms of social critique that they wouldn't otherwise be. So yeah, I mean, for that reason, I mean, the book is about drugs. Every page talks about drugs, but it's not really about drugs at the end of the day. It's about how drugs is a lens for seeing a broad range of things about American society. Okay.
Benjamin Fong, Quick Fixes, Drugs in America, From Prohibition to the 21st Century Binge. Thank you for joining us. Ben is Associate Director at the Center for Work and Democracy and Associate Professor in the Barrett Honors College here at ASU. I'm Michael McQuarrie. I'm the Director of the Center, and I hope you'll join us at our future events. Thank you very much for being here.
Thanks.